A billionaire in disguise. The social experiment that exposed a harsh reality. Nathaniel Carter sat in the back seat of his Rolls-Royce, fingers drumming lightly against the leather armrest. The tinted windows blurred the world outside, the world he had built, where doors opened before he could knock, and where people listened before he even had to raise his voice. But today, Nathaniel Carter wasn't the billionaire, the philanthropist, the man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and at charity galas. Today, he was no one. His driver, a steadfast man named Luis, who had been by his side for years, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Are you sure about this, sir?" Nathaniel adjusted the worn-out hoodie he had pulled over his head. It smelled of must and age, the fabric stiff and faded from years of use. "Yeah," he said, stuffing a cheap prepaid phone into his pocket. "I need to see it for myself." Luis hesitated. "If anything goes wrong, I'll call you." Luis sighed but nodded. "I'll be close." Nathaniel stepped out of the car, and the crisp air hit him instantly. The transformation was immediate. Without his tailored suits and polished shoes, without the silent announcement of wealth that usually preceded him, he became invisible. Pulling the hood lower over his face, he made his way toward the park. It was pristine, orderly. Parents pushed expensive strollers along paved paths. Joggers passed by in sleek athletic gear, and an elderly couple sat near the water, tossing breadcrumbs to the ducks. Nathaniel walked to a weathered bench shaded by a row of trees and sat down. Then he waited. At first, nothing happened. People passed by, stealing quick glances before looking away. A man in a business suit approaching from the right slowed slightly, eyes narrowing as he took in Nathaniel's hunched posture and ragged clothes. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but instead, he pulled out his phone and veered toward another path. A woman in yoga leggings and a designer jacket pushed her stroller past him, her grip tightening on the handle as she picked up her pace. Nathaniel exhaled, leaning back against the bench. No one was yelling at him. No one was harassing him, but the avoidance was deafening. He was being categorized, dismissed, his presence a disruption in a space he wasn't meant to occupy. Across the park, a patrol car crept forward, its tires rolling slowly over the pavement. Nathaniel's gaze flickered toward it. The moment of truth. The car idled for a few seconds before parking. From the driver's side, a man stepped out, tall, built like an ex-football player, with a neatly trimmed mustache and an unreadable expression. Officer Martin Hayes. Hayes didn't approach right away. He just watched, assessing, calculating. Nathaniel could feel the weight of his scrutiny. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the officer took a step forward. Nathaniel remained still, hands resting on his lap. He had spent years in boardrooms negotiating billion-dollar deals with men who measure power by their wealth. But here, on this bench, power was perception. Hayes walked toward him, his boots crunching against the gravel. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't even speak at first. He just observed. Then, "You been here long?" Hayes finally asked, his voice flat. Nathaniel turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's gaze. He let his voice carry a rasp, a tiredness he didn't actually feel. Just sitting. Hayes's eyes flicked over him, his faded jeans, the worn hoodie, the scuffed-up sneakers he had picked up at a thrift store that morning. The officer's expression didn't change, but his stance did. More rigid, more alert. "You from around here?" Nathaniel shrugged. "Just passing through." Hayes didn't like that answer. His fingers twitched near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough that the message was clear. "This is a family park," the officer said, his tone tightening. "We've had complaints about people loitering." Nathaniel almost laughed. Loitering, not sitting, not resting. Loitering, a word that turned stillness into suspicion. "Did someone complain about me?" he asked, tilting his head. Hayes didn't answer. Instead, his radio crackled softly. He muttered something Nathaniel couldn't make out. A silent request for backup? Or just letting dispatch know he was occupied? The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The joggers from earlier had found new routes. The elderly couple near the water had disappeared. Even a mother with the stroller had turned away, pretending to be engrossed in her phone. No one was watching, yet everyone was aware. Hayes let out a breath through his nose. Look, I don't know what your situation is, but if you need a place to go, there's a shelter about 2 miles west. Nathaniel almost laughed again. 2 miles west. He owned a high-rise building just 3 blocks away. But he didn't say that. Instead, he held Hayes's gaze and asked, "Am I breaking any laws?" The hesitation was slight, but it was there. A tightening of the jaw. A flicker of irritation. "If you don't have business here, I'd suggest moving along." There it was. The expectation. The unspoken rule. People like him, or at least the version of him they assumed, weren't supposed to stay in places like this. Nathaniel leaned back on the bench, deliberately slow. "And if I don't?" Hayes shifted his weight. "Then we got a problem." But Nathaniel was about to show him that the real problem wasn't him. It was the way the world decided who belonged and who didn't. The air between them was stretched tight, waiting to snap. Nathaniel had faced tough negotiators, ruthless investors, media sharks looking for the slightest misstep. But this was different. Officer Hayes didn't see a man who had built an empire from the ground up. He saw a problem to remove. The standoff continued, until Hayes finally reached for his cuffs. "Stand up," he ordered. Nathaniel stayed seated. "On what grounds?" "Obstruction." A beat of silence. Nathaniel's voice was steady. "You really want to do this?" Hayes hesitated. The moment hung between them, thick, suffocating. Then Nathaniel reached into his hoodie pocket, careful, slow, and pulled out his phone. A few taps on the screen. Then he turned around. The headline flashed on the screen. Billionaire philanthropist Nathaniel Carter donates $200,000 to local police initiatives. Silence. Hayes's expression cracked. Officer Reed, who had just arrived as backup, leaned in and read the headline, then looked back at Nathaniel, eyes widening with recognition. Nathaniel nodded. "Yeah, that's me." The crowd had grown. People whispering. Filming. "You assumed I was homeless," Nathaniel said, his voice even. "You assumed I was a threat. And the moment I didn't comply, you escalated." Hayes's face burned red, embarrassment, anger, maybe both. But Nathaniel wasn't done. "If I were wearing a suit, would you have questioned me?" Silence. "If I were a white man, sitting here in these same clothes, would you have called for backup?" Hayes had no answer. Nathaniel exhaled. That's the problem. The story went viral overnight. The next morning, his name was everywhere. But the bigger question was louder than any excuse being made. Why does respect only come with wealth and status?